Right. Well, the condition is called Gorlin Syndrome, and it's a medical condition that affects many parts of the body, the jaw, the skin, and some internal problems as well.
Okay. Do you see your support group as a peer support group or a service provider, a combination of both, or an advocacy group?
Really, it's just a mutual support group, but we are in touch with the American and the English groups who are a bit more sophisticated.
How did you get involved? What's the story there?
Well, I first actually showed signs of the condition when I was in my teenage years, but we didn't know what that is, with benign tumours in the jaw. And then I started producing skin cancers when I was 25, and I had treatment privately for 10 years. And a friend suggested, because I had a bad reaction to radium, that I go to Peter MacCallum Hospital. And there, very fortunately for me, I was diagnosed correctly on my first day. So I was not given the wrong treatment, and so I just had to listen to the advice I was given and modify my way of life to do that. In the 80s, the Queensland Institute of Medical Research did research into the gene, and they isolated it. And then also in the middle 80s, there was a trial of a cream to try and stop the BCCs. And I met some other Gorlin syndrome. So that would have been about 5 years after I was diagnosed. I met some other Gorlin syndrome patients, and we found we just liked talking to each other, sharing experiences, because people who don't know think, oh, well, it's only BCCs, it won't kill you. I've been told that many times. And so you feel so self-conscious. And so, but when Professor Trench and the others isolated the gene, she started writing a newsletter, and that was such a comfort to hear the stories of others all around Australia. And I stayed in touch with one of the women I met on that trial. She was there with her son, and we thought we'd like to start a support group, but it just was beyond us at the time. I had 2 teenage boys, and she didn't want to. So I waited. I hoped somebody else would do it. But then after 30 years, I thought, well, I've got to reach out and try. Otherwise, I'd always regret it. So I asked Peter Mac for the loan of a room, and I wrote to all the public hospitals and all the consultants I knew. But even so, nobody new turned up. At that stage, it was only, the incidence was 1 in 55,000. So it wasn't too surprising. So I wrote to Professor Trench in Queensland and told her that we hadn't had a good response. And she snail-mailed everybody she'd interviewed, including enclosing a letter from me telling my story. And if they wanted to be in touch, contact me. Well, I got quite a few replies, and then we decided we'd try another meeting at Peter Mac. And we got a gentleman from New South and a couple from South Australia, but no new Victorians. So it's obvious I'd have to start an online group. And I thought, well, where? I just didn't have the skills, I felt. And that's when I first came to Genetic Services Network, and I met Louise DiPietro and a young student called Stephanie. And they were such a great support. And it helped me in many, many ways, not just to start the group, but to be more at peace with myself, because my mother had talked about bad blood. And once I got my diagnosis, although there was a comfort in getting a name, there was great discomfort in thinking I had this bad blood which I could pass on. So at that meeting with the couple from South Australia, they were interested, and so I got 6 replies from South Australia, and with their permission I put them in touch with Margaret. And that's over 10 years, and they meet 3 or 4 times a year for lunch. We've been across for a few of them. I think the first thing that helped me to be at peace the young student said to me, "We have many genes." And I hadn't thought of that. I thought we were either good or bad. And that gave me, it's like an affirmation, I'm okay. But then meeting others, hearing they were having the same difficulties with not having a social life. And sorry, but I have to say, being ashamed and being very self-conscious, because people do stare if you've got scars all over your face. And I've been asked a few times, had I gone through a windscreen, or been in a fight. So it just was a comfort to talk to others. And they all said the same. They hadn't met anybody else for 14, 15, and even 19 years. And it was just a great relief.
It was just nice to know that you're not alone.
Exactly. That was what we were just really wanting to say. You're not alone, and if you want to be in touch, fine. Some are in touch by email only. And one of the young men from Adelaide, he started a Facebook group for people in Australia and overseas. And that has been absolutely marvellous, because overseas people help us too.
Knowing all that, how does that make you feel?
I'm just glad that it is happening. And I've met some great people. I met the widow of the man who started the English group, and 3 of her 4 children inherited the disease. And that also makes me, again, so appreciative that I was diagnosed correctly, because he died, he was only about 51. And it makes me feel I can be, what I find difficult, it's less difficult if I'm sharing it and people say yes. Or even, for instance, I used to do an email every week to everybody, the email address, and invite them to put their questions. And one was, what do you do the week before surgery? Because that's when we get tense. We don't know what we're going to finish up like, because there are only little red spots on the outside, but they're rodent ulcers underneath. And we give each other advice, even have a social outing or read books, do something. It's simple things, but also what medications not to take.
But sometimes they need to hear that from someone else.
Yes. I think at times when we meet a medical specialist, we're overwhelmed. I know I do with all the terminology. So somebody who's been through it, who walked the same path, it's assuring, I think. Oh yes, I'd like to see young people involved. When I go to Adelaide, there are 3 young men. One of them did start the Facebook group, but the other 2, they're happy to be at the lunches, but they don't want to take over. And I find in Victoria too, I still only have 4 family involved, and they don't want to take over as organising the group. Yes. But they're happy to be involved. Getting more members, I think. With the Facebook group, people don't have to be involved. They can pose their questions and there will for sure be a reply, or even just a reply saying, we're thinking of you, we're with you. Others, it might be giving advice of what they did or where they went. I know with the Adelaide group, one person's plastic surgeon retired and somebody was able to give them the name of theirs. Well, for those who have children with the condition, 3 of my friends do, it's being aware that they're trying to cope with their own treatment and also supporting their child, or they're now grown-up children, but it's very, very difficult. And I did lose a friend December 2 years ago, and we had a celebration of her life before her death. And her son just said to me, I'm going the same way. Because he couldn't see any future, even though we've got a new drug now that's stopping the number of surgeries we have to have. he knew eventually he would possibly go the same way. Financially, it can be a very big drain. On our Facebook group, a member from Cairns had to just had to put off surgery because I don't have the $2,500 and Bupa haven't come to the party with her hospital. Now, by leaving that cyst, it could go into her sinuses or her eardrums. They can cause terrible damage. Also, Medicare, when I was having our treatment privately, they deemed my treatment to be excessive. The first time I approached the Ombudsman, and my plastic surgeon wrote explaining the whole condition, but it took quite a while for them to pay, and if they didn't pay, my private health insurance wouldn't pay either. I think we need a mediator that, another post was, how come I'm paying a single mum $60 a week to Bupa, and yet I'm so much out of pocket when it comes to surgery? There are so many, it's not just the surgeons, the anaesthetists, the pathology, the use of the daycare centre, it's just not covered. And Medicare don't, as I say, twice they've said my treatment is excessive. The second time, my gynecologist sent in the pathology report and they paid. OPGs, that's the scan of the jaw, which we're meant to have every 2 years. My friend in Adelaide has to have it every year, and Medicare will not fund it. So it's a couple of $100, but it all adds up, and we all have felt the financial strain.
What else would you want that mediator to do?
I think that would be a full-time job. Yeah. It really would, because it would mean perhaps negotiating with the surgeons or the practitioners to perhaps only charge standard fee. And that mediator could even perhaps help people that we haven't seen. But people with chronic conditions do need help. And also, well, with travel insurance, that was where I had a big thing. They said they wouldn't cover me for anything related to Gorlin Syndrome. So I said, do you mean what I've already experienced? And they said, no, anything. And, well, they say we're more prone to other types of cancer, as happened with my friend. So I didn't feel covered. The only thing that was covered was my luggage. They've come back now and they just say they won't cover me for BCCs, and I accept that. It's up to me. I really sort of don't know. I'd like people, some younger people with more ideas to promote the idea of a group and meeting. I should add, some people do not come to the lunches or the morning teas because they're scared of what they'll see. Before I started this drug, they brought out a new treatment called PDT that it would, for me, it meant I could continue with my work or my studies, but Medicare will not cover it. It's $400 a treatment and you have to have 2 treatments. So I think that mediator could also perhaps promote. I wrote to the government, to my local member, and they wouldn't budge, and it's ridiculous because we all want to still be part of society. I appreciate that that they can only fund so much, but always remember there's a person with the condition. The person has feelings as well as cancer, and to even meet us halfway.